In the spring of 1943, when the war in the Pacific had reached its most unpredictable phase, the Allied intelligence services were confronted with a problem they could not solve through machines, mathematics, or manpower. The jungles of Burma had become an impenetrable labyrinth, swallowing soldiers, aircraft, and information alike. The Japanese army had learned to live within that world of dripping vines, leeches, and ambushes. For the Americans and British, it was an environment where technology failed and where human reconnaissance came at the cost of countless lives. Inside this atmosphere of desperation and imagination, an idea was born within the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, America's wartime intelligence agency. The proposal was simple in words and absurd in practice: the use of trained monkeys as mobile reconnaissance agents capable of carrying miniature cameras through jungle terrain and returning with valuable visual intelligence. It began as a memorandum circulating through OSS Section X, a branch devoted to unconventional warfare and experimental field research. The memo, unsigned and undated, proposed that primates, being indigenous to much of Southeast Asia, could operate undetected in regions under Japanese control. Their natural agility would allow them to navigate terrain impossible for human agents, and their familiarity to the environment would attract no attention. The plan suggested conditioning monkeys to respond to an auditory signal and to carry a lightweight photographic device. Once trained, they would be released near suspected enemy positions, the cameras set to record timed exposures, and after completion, the animals would return upon hearing the signal. To those removed from the front lines, the notion seemed practical, even visionary. It was one more example of the OSS's peculiar faith that any obstacle, no matter how irrational, could be overcome by scientific ingenuity. The project was given provisional funding and the unofficial code name Operation Primus. Responsibility for implementation fell to a small detachment assembled in Ceylon, then serving as an OSS logistics and training hub for operations in the China-Burma-India theater. The officer appointed to oversee it was Captain Harold Madsen, formerly a zoologist specializing in primate cognition at the University of Wisconsin. His academic expertise made him an ideal candidate for what was, at least on paper, a scientific experiment. In practice, it was a bizarre intersection of field zoology and wartime improvisation. Madsen's unit was modest in size and resources. It consisted of 2 animal handlers borrowed from the Calcutta Zoo, a naval technician to modify the photographic equipment, and a single OSS intelligence officer to compile reports. The initial consignment of monkeys, a group of Indian rhesus macaques, arrived by ship in April 1943. They were housed in bamboo enclosures near the coastal training camp, where the air smelled of damp salt, sweat, and kerosene. The men who handled them were not sure whether to salute or feed them. For weeks, the team labored under the tropical sun, attempting to transform ordinary jungle animals into disciplined instruments of war. The first phase was behavioral conditioning. The monkeys were taught to associate the sound of a specific whistle with food. The process was monotonous but initially successful. Within days, the animals learned to respond to the signal and return to their cages. Encouraged, the team proceeded to the second phase, equipping the monkeys with the small reconnaissance cameras. These cameras were adapted from aerial gun cameras, stripped down to a fraction of their original size and weight. Constructed of aluminum and fitted with a spring wound mechanism, they could capture still images at timed intervals. The devices were attached to the animals by a harness designed to balance the weight evenly across the chest. What looked logical in diagrams proved disastrous in reality. The monkeys, alarmed by the unfamiliar objects and mechanical noises, tore at the straps, chewed the harnesses, and dismantled the cameras with astonishing dexterity. Several pieces of valuable equipment were lost or destroyed. The men attempted to desensitize the animals by gradually increasing the duration of wearing the harnesses, but the results were inconsistent. Madsen recorded in his notes that the monkeys exhibited a range of temperaments from curiosity to outright hostility. He persisted, convinced that with patience the animals could be acclimated. By early May, the first field trials began. The site chosen was a wooded area outside the main camp, where dense undergrowth and uneven terrain mimicked jungle conditions. The plan was to release the monkeys with loaded cameras, allow them to roam for a predetermined period, and then retrieve them using the whistle signal. In practice, the tests quickly collapsed into chaos. Most of the monkeys fled into the trees and refused to return. One was recovered hours later, minus both the camera and its harness. The second returned with the mechanism shattered, film torn, and saliva stained. The third disappeared entirely, presumed lost to the surrounding forest. Despite repeated failure, reports continued to be filed upward through the chain of command. Each iteration adjusted the methodology, improved harnesses, modified training signals, and simplified equipment. OSS headquarters, operating thousands of miles away in Washington, viewed the experiment as a curiosity worth minimal expense. It remained a classified sideshow to more pressing operations, yet as the Burma campaign worsened, interest briefly rekindled. The Allied command was desperate for any advantage in the unending stalemate against Japanese jungle forces. In that atmosphere, even the most implausible proposals were given another chance. In June, Madsen's unit was ordered to move closer to the operational zone. The relocation brought them to northern Burma, near areas used by British Chindit forces conducting long-range raids behind enemy lines. There, surrounded by thick vegetation, stifling humidity, and the constant drone of insects, the team resumed its experiments. Supplies were scarce, and the health of both men and animals deteriorated rapidly. Malaria spread through the camp, and the monkeys, suffering from stress and malnutrition, grew increasingly unmanageable. Attempts to train them further were met with unpredictable behavior. Some animals became aggressive, others simply ignored commands. The cameras, delicate and prone to jamming, rarely survived more than a few missions. To improve results, Madsen designed an alternate protocol. Instead of relying on return signals, the monkeys would be conditioned to approach specific sounds recorded on phonographic devices hidden near suspected Japanese encampments. Once there, the cameras would automatically trigger, capturing images for a set duration before the film could be retrieved by Allied patrols. It was an intricate system dependent on perfect timing, equipment reliability, and animal cooperation. Three elements that rarely aligned in wartime jungles. The first operational test produced nothing but blurred images of foliage and, in one sequence, the indistinct outline of a wild animal later identified as a tiger. By late July, the project had devolved into frustration. The OSS headquarters, facing mounting logistical demands, began to question the value of continuing the effort. Reports from the field described the operational impracticality of training primates for reconnaissance purposes under combat conditions. The cost of shipping new cameras and feed supplies outweighed any potential gain. On August 3, 1943, an internal communication recommended termination of Operation Primus, citing unpredictable animal behavior and excessive material loss. The official closure order arrived weeks later. The surviving monkeys were transferred to a local zoological facility under British supervision. The equipment was dismantled and the personnel reassigned. The OSS archives retained only fragments of documentation, technical notes, expense ledgers, and Madsen's final report. The language was clinical, stripped of emotion, but beneath it one senses quiet exhaustion. The conclusion stated that the cognitive capacity of the selected primate species does not support sustained obedience under stress or conditioned retrieval in the presence of combat stimuli. In Washington, the project was treated with mild amusement and quickly buried among hundreds of experimental files. Within the broader history of the OSS, it became little more than a footnote, overshadowed by other eccentric ventures such as pigeon-guided bombs, exploding bats, and sound-based deception units. For the men who had worked on it, however, it lingered as an emblem of wartime absurdity, a reminder of how desperation could push rational minds toward the edge of the impossible. Madsen returned to the United States in 1945, physically weakened but professionally altered. He resumed academic research, focusing on animal behavior under stress, though he never publicly discussed his wartime assignment. His post-war publications referenced field studies of primate response to artificial stimuli in adverse environments, phrasing vague enough to conceal their true origin. Among colleagues, he was respected as a quiet, meticulous scientist. Only years later, when fragments of the OSS files were declassified, did researchers connect his cryptic writings to the forgotten experiment in Burma. The rediscovery of the documents in the 1970s revealed a story both tragic and absurd. The declassified summaries described a program driven not by recklessness, but by genuine belief in scientific creativity as a weapon. In the cold logic of wartime bureaucracy, nothing was too strange if it might save lives or shorten the conflict. The monkeys of Operation Primus were never meant as a joke. They were products of a mindset that sought control over every variable, even nature itself. The reports noted the ingenuity of the camera designs, the dedication of the personnel, and the ultimate futility of the idea. The most cited line, scrawled in pencil on one report margin, read simply, "Monkeys preferred to eat the equipment." It became a symbol of the gap between theory and reality, intellect and instinct. Historians who later examined the OSS archives saw in Operation Primus a microcosm of the broader wartime experimentation ethos. Across every front, governments were investing in ideas that defied common sense: remote-controlled explosives, sonic deception, hallucinogen-based interrogation methods, and animal-assisted delivery systems. The common thread was an almost religious belief in innovation. It did not matter whether the concept was practical. It mattered that it represented motion, progress, and initiative in a war defined by uncertainty. In that climate, even a project involving monkeys carrying cameras through hostile jungles could seem rational. In retrospect, the story of Operation Primus is not simply an anecdote of failed experimentation, but a reflection of the human condition under pressure. The war demanded solutions at any cost, and those who served within the OSS were tasked with making the impossible possible. The experiment's collapse did not stem from incompetence, but from the limits of control itself. The natural world resisted manipulation, and in that resistance lay an uncomfortable truth. Intelligence could not be mechanized through instinct, nor could chaos be tamed by procedure. When researchers revisited the records decades later, they found no photographs from the project. The surviving camera housings had long corroded, and the film was lost. What remained were descriptions of blurred negatives showing leaves, sky, and indistinct movement, images without meaning, like echoes of a forgotten idea. The files were eventually transferred to the National Archives, catalogued under Experimental Animal Reconnaissance, Burma, 1943. They occupy less than a single folder, Yet from that thin archive emerges a haunting portrait of a moment when imagination exceeded reason. The men who built the project were not fools or dreamers. They were scientists and soldiers confronted by an enemy hidden within a living fortress of jungle. They turned to nature itself, hoping to find an ally in the creatures that thrived where men could not. The failure of their plan is unsurprising, but its existence remains profound. It speaks to a kind of faith unique to wartime, the belief that even the wildest idea might somehow change the course of history. Today, Operation Primus survives only in obscure footnotes and in the scattered humor of those who rediscovered it. To read the reports is to sense both the absurdity and the sincerity of the effort. There is no moral, no dramatic revelation, only the quiet echo of human persistence against impossible odds. The jungle remains, indifferent and eternal, just as it was in 1943, when a group of men tried to teach its inhabitants to become spies. In that distant world of rain, rot, and rumor, the boundaries between science and folly dissolved. The OSS believed that knowledge itself could be weaponized, that through intelligence, even the natural order might be enlisted into war. What they found instead was the limit of control, embodied in the simple, stubborn behavior of the primates they sought to command. The monkeys obeyed their instincts, not their orders, and in doing so, they preserved the last untouched frontier of the natural world amid humanity's most mechanized conflict. Thus ended the strangest reconnaissance mission of the Second World War, not with discovery, not with scandal, but with silence, the rustle of leaves, and the faint ticking of an abandoned camera lost somewhere in the Burmese jungle. The legacy of Operation Primus did not vanish entirely with the closure of the project. Although it had failed as a practical endeavor, the documentation it generated circulated quietly among research divisions within the Allied scientific and intelligence communities. In the winter of 1944, as victory in the Pacific still seemed distant, OSS analysts began compiling a confidential review of experimental field technologies. A broad survey meant to assess which wartime innovations might inform future intelligence doctrine. Within that compendium, a short section labeled Biological Reconnaissance Concepts referenced the primate project. It described the use of non-human organisms for observation, signal relay, and equipment transport, noting limited success due to cognitive unpredictability and environmental interference. While the language was cautious, the subtext revealed a continuing fascination with the idea of merging biology and surveillance, a fascination that would, in decades to come, evolve into the field now known as bio-cybernetic intelligence. For those who had been involved, the closure of the program left an aftertaste of quiet disillusionment. Captain Harold Madsen, whose name appeared only in a few redacted memoranda, remained in Burma until the final months of the campaign. He was transferred to a logistics unit attached to the British 14th Army, responsible for analyzing terrain imagery and vegetation patterns from aerial reconnaissance. Though his wartime journal has never been found, his later correspondence with colleagues hints at a man haunted less by failure than by the strange intimacy of his work, the memory of trying to impose human logic upon instinctual creatures in an environment that defied order. He wrote in one letter to a former professor that the jungle itself behaves like a living intelligence, one that resists measurement. After returning to the United States in late 1945, Madsen joined the Army's post-war Scientific Advisory Board, where his expertise in animal cognition was quietly repurposed for behavioral research under Project Paperclip's broader umbrella of psychological sciences. There, the lessons of Operation Primus acquired new meaning. The war had proven that intelligence was no longer confined to human agents or mechanical devices. It could, theoretically, inhabit any form: animal, machine, or hybrid. Madson's failed monkeys became, paradoxically, early case studies in what the military would later call biological interface experimentation. By the early 1950s, similar efforts reappeared under new names and classifications. Declassified fragments from U.S. Navy archives mention a marine fauna surveillance initiative which sought to train sea mammals for harbor reconnaissance, a direct descendant of Primus in concept, if not in execution. Later projects involving dolphins, pigeons, and even cats would claim partial inspiration from the wartime primate tests. The language of the reports changed, but the underlying desire remained identical: to make nature itself an accomplice to human warfare. Historians examining these later programs often traced their intellectual lineage back to the OSS. They noted that the agency's culture of experimentation had blurred the lines between science fiction and operational strategy. The post-war intelligence establishment, inheriting both the successes and absurdities of the OSS, institutionalized that mindset. To the bureaucratic imagination of the early Cold War, there were no bad ideas, only insufficiently tested ones. Within that framework, even the memory of monkeys eating reconnaissance cameras became a data point in the evolving logic of innovation. In 1957, Madsen published a book titled Behavior Under Constraint: Studies in Adaptive Cognition, printed by a small academic press. Though couched in scientific neutrality, several passages are unmistakably autobiographical. He described the illusion of mastery that arises when man confronts nature not as participant but as architect, and warned that the attempt to turn instinct into instrument inevitably collapses under the weight of its own presumption. The book received little attention outside academic circles, but among military research communities it circulated as a reference text. Marginal notes in surviving library copies suggest that readers from defense institutions found particular interest in his case descriptions of field learning failures among conditioned primates. During the 1960s, when the Vietnam conflict revived American engagement with the Asian tropics, a new generation of intelligence officers rediscovered the OSS archives. Among the dusty files labeled Unconventional Operations lay the reports of Operation Primus. To these men, raised in the shadow of high-technology warfare, the documents read like relics from a prehistoric era, yet something about them resonated. The challenges described by Madsen's team, humidity, concealment, invisibility of the enemy, were unchanged. In an internal memo dated 1965, an analyst remarked that the jungle remains the same adversary, only the names of the armies differ. Inspired by these parallels, a small research cell at Fort Detrick conducted theoretical modeling on the feasibility of using small autonomous organisms as environmental sensors. They referenced the Primus files not as a failure but as a proof of biological responsiveness. Their argument was that if animals could not be trained to act as agents, perhaps their involuntary reactions could serve as indicators, movements, sounds, or physiological changes signaling human presence nearby. In a strange, indirect way, the monkeys of 1943 continued to influence military thought long after their bones had vanished into the Burmese soil. Meanwhile, the surviving physical remnants of the project, the harness fragments, corroded cameras, and supply ledgers, followed their own quiet migration through the bureaucratic afterlife. Transferred from OSS storage to the newly created CIA archives in 1947, they were later declassified and moved to the National Archives in Maryland in 1975. Archivists, uncertain of their significance, catalogued them under a general heading of animal experimentation. Only decades later did historians reconstruct the full narrative from cross-referenced documents and personal correspondence. Among those historians was Dr. Eleanor Hastings, a British scholar of wartime innovation who stumbled upon the Primus file while researching deception operations. Her 1989 paper, Agents of Nature, Biological Experiments in Allied Intelligence, was the first to tell the story publicly. She described the project not as folly, but as an inevitable product of the wartime mindset, a moment when creativity and desperation merged into one. Hastings wrote that, "To understand the logic of Operation Primus is to understand the psychology of total war, where every living thing becomes a potential instrument of strategy." Her essay restored to the record not only the project's existence but also its human dimension, the faces of scientists, soldiers, and handlers who had believed, however briefly, that they could teach the jungle to serve. Her publication provoked renewed academic interest. Journalists seized upon the story's surreal aspects: monkeys as spies, cameras chewed and destroyed, while scholars focused on its deeper implications. In conferences and documentaries, Operation Primus became a case study in the ethics of scientific experimentation during wartime. Philosophers debated whether the line between necessity and absurdity could ever be clearly drawn. Psychologists analyzed the behavioral records as early examples of stress adaptation. Environmental historians viewed it as a precursor to modern discussions of ecological manipulation. Each discipline found its own reflection within the archive's fragments. What none of them could fully reconstruct, however, was the sensory reality of the project: the texture of the jungle, the stench of the cages, the heat that warped metal and infected wounds. Those details survive only in the few surviving pages of Madson's field notes, preserved through chance among the personal effects of a British liaison officer. The notes describe daily struggles that never entered official reports: mold destroying film stock, insects nesting inside equipment, torrential rain turning camps into rivers of mud. Between observations on animal conditioning are sudden shifts into near-poetic language. "The jungle consumes all design," he wrote once, "as though it were correcting our arrogance." Reading those words today, one senses how the project transformed from an experiment into a meditation on the limits of control. Operation Primus was not defeated by enemy action, but by the environment itself, by the indifference of a world that refused to cooperate with human intention. That indifference, more than any strategic failure, marked the boundary between science and hubris. After Madson's death in 1968, his personal papers were donated to the University of Wisconsin's Anthropology Department. Among them was an unpublished manuscript tentatively titled The Intelligence of Wilderness. The text, part memoir and part treatise, expanded upon themes he had hinted at for years: the idea that intelligence is not solely a property of the mind, but a behavior of systems, ecological, instinctual, collective. In one passage, he reflected indirectly on his wartime experience, writing that, "In teaching animals to serve war, we confronted the possibility that the true agent of observation was never the trained creature, but the landscape that absorbed and redirected our intent." Those who studied the manuscript later called it prophetic, anticipating ecological philosophy decades ahead of its time. Yet it also stands as a quiet confession, an acknowledgment that the boundary between mastery and misunderstanding had always been blurred. The war had forced Madson and his peers to explore that boundary with terrible urgency. Their failure, seen through this later lens, becomes almost redemptive, a reminder that the attempt to dominate nature reveals not its weakness, but our dependence upon it. By the early 21st century, when digitized archives made the OSS files accessible to the public, Operation Primus found new life in popular culture. Documentaries and online articles retold the story with varying degrees of accuracy, often emphasizing its comic absurdity. Headlines referred to spy monkeys and the strangest mission of World War II. Yet beneath the amusement, some viewers sensed a darker resonance, the idea that human ingenuity, unchecked by humility, inevitably reaches for control over the uncontrollable. In interviews, modern intelligence officers acknowledged the project as a curious ancestor to contemporary debates about artificial intelligence and autonomous surveillance. The tools had changed, the ambition had not. In academic circles, Operation Primus came to symbolize a kind of moral parable. It illustrated how innovation thrives at the edge of reason and how desperation transforms imagination into doctrine. For military historians, it revealed the bureaucratic machinery that allows improbable ideas to exist, proposals reviewed, budgets approved, materials shipped, all propelled by the inertia of belief. For philosophers of science, it embodied the tension between curiosity and exploitation. For ecologists, it was a cautionary tale about the consequences of seeing living systems as extensions of human will. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of the story lies not in its lessons, but in its silence. No record exists of what became of the monkeys themselves after the project's termination. They disappeared into the post-war noise, unremarked and unremembered. Some may have been absorbed into local ecosystems, others likely perished during the chaotic final months of the Burma campaign. Their fate, unrecorded, completes the circle of the story, an experiment that began with an attempt to control nature and ended by being reabsorbed into it. In the modern archives, their presence survives only through absence: scratches on a camera casing, teeth marks on a brass lens ring, fragments of fabric stiffened by humidity. To the untrained eye, these are meaningless artifacts. To those who know the story, they are the last traces of a forgotten frontier where science, war, and wilderness briefly collided. Seen from today's distance, Operation Primus occupies an ambiguous place between tragedy and farce. It demonstrates that human ingenuity, when pressed to its limits, produces both the sublime and the ridiculous. The scientists who conceived it were neither villains nor fools. They were participants in a collective experiment, not just upon animals, but upon the boundaries of imagination itself. Theirs was a time when information was power, and power justified anything that might bring it. In that light, the attempt to send monkeys into battle becomes not a joke, but a mirror, reflecting a civilization determined to remake the world in its own image, even in the heart of the jungle. And so the story endures, quietly, in footnotes and archives, its absurdity softened by time, its meaning sharpened by reflection. The forgotten cameras, rusted and silent, lie somewhere in a storage vault, unviewed for decades. They are relics not of failure but of faith, faith in the limitless reach of human reason and in the haunting beauty of its collapse.